gather together a lot of information about what's going on in different states. Just a quick note on methodology. So what we've done here, this report is based on a combination of data analysis, analysis of kind of legislation, any administrative policy where it's available, and some case studies with state leaders. We've used rapid data as the kind of DOL published data official source on apprenticeships. But just to know, Rapid's data can be different from some state level data. There's been some changes over time in how Rapid is collected and published that aren't that well documented. So we have to treat the data in this report with a pinch of salt. We've looked at registered apprenticeships only, mainly because of data availability, but just to acknowledge there's a lot going on outside that, especially on youth apprenticeships. We've looked at the last decade, so we've gone back to 2014. That's largely because of data availability, but just to note that's a bit of a kind of arbitrary cutoff point. So just going on to the next slide, I'm gonna jump to the end and kind of what we found out. So the report contains a host of information on what states are doing policy-wise to expand and grow apprenticeships. From this, we identified the kind of top five promising practices that we think all states should be thinking about. The first one is setting targets for apprenticeship growth. So Adele's probably going to talk about this later and what Governor Newsom's done in California. But we think this can be, a low or no cost activity. It doesn't necessarily generate starts in itself, but can act as a really powerful tool to kind of galvanize activity in a state around apprenticeships, raise apprenticeships up the priority list. The second one is funding. So if you look at federal funding on apprenticeships, it's grown quite substantially over the period we looked at. It tends to be competitive short-term grants. So these are important for helping with the kind of the startup costs of programs, getting programs off the ground, but this doesn't really necessarily allow for kind of sustainability and growth and expansion. And what we've seen is there's a handful of states that are leading the way in setting up pay for apprenticeship, formula-based funding, where funding is consistent on a per apprenticeship basis. The third area where we saw loads of promising activity is states partnering with with intermediaries. So states are kind of increasingly recognizing the role of intermediaries in the apprenticeship system to reduce friction, to kind of help hide the wiring for employers on apprenticeships. And we've seen this has been a really key tool internationally. So England, France, Australia, where there's been rapid expansion on apprenticeships in the past 10, 15 years. All of that has been contingent on developing a flourishing intermediary field. Fourth area that we found promising activity is on procurement. So there's 14 states that used public works procurement to boost apprenticeship. So they have a kind of requirement to hire apprentices or some kind of mechanism to encourage employers to think about apprenticeship. At the moment, this is only really in construction, with the exception of New York City, who are using this a bit more broadly. But we think expanding this to other industries, other areas of state contracting, like an IT contract, could be a really promising way to expand apprenticeships using existing state dollars. Finally, state workforces. So again, we've seen this internationally. Other countries have used kind of public sector hiring to be a trailblazer for growing apprenticeships, and we've seen particular progress in the US, in Colorado and Maryland. But there's lots of states thinking about how they can use the public sector to grow apprenticeships. So taking a step back and just looking at the data on who's growing, there's lots of different ways to measure the growth of apprenticeships. You can look at the kind of new apprenticeships each year, the change in that the number of apprentices overall. Where we've settled is this graph, which looks at active apprentices as a portion of the labour force and the change in time over that. So the purple bars are 2014 and the green bars are 2024. What this shows, just drawing out a couple of points. First of all, there's a lot of green. There's been great progress over the last decade. So some states have increased apprenticeships by a factor of 5, 6, 7 over just 10 years. On the more pessimistic side, across the board, this is still quite low. So even the kind of highest states here are below 1% of the labour force as apprentices, whereas if you look internationally, countries like England and Canada have kind of 8 to 10 times more than that, and that's not even looking at the kind of traditional apprentice powerhouses of Germany and Switzerland, where 3 to 4% of the workforce are apprentices. Moving on to the policy side. One more point before that. So we think that that measure of active apprentices in the labour force is a kind of best measure that we have to look at apprentice growth at the moment, but we shouldn't use it without context. So the report also looks at occupational diversity, how states are spreading apprentices beyond the kind of traditional field of construction and the trades into new occupations and industries where there's been lots of progress. We look at age and gender as well, where again, there's been lots of progress, more equal gender balance, especially in states like South Carolina and West Virginia, but it's still further to go. One area we couldn't look at was racial and ethnic diversity, where the data just isn't sufficient to draw any conclusions. So that's definitely an area for further research. Moving into the policy side. So the bulk of the report looks at the kind of the practices that states are using to grow. What we did here is look at kind of 4 different categories of activity. So administration, how states are setting up their regulation of the system, promotion and funding, how states are incentivizing employers, integration, the way states are kind of tying together apprenticeships with other areas of government activity, particularly in education systems, and kind of targeted activity where states are looking at particular populations, industries for expansion of apprenticeships. I'm going to skip through this quickly so we can get onto the panel discussion. Beyond the kind of promising practices we talked about earlier, a few things to highlight. So we've heard about kind of amazing progress on the regulatory administration side. So Shonda may touch on it earlier with Kansas, later with Kansas. But states have been able to kind of dramatically reduce the registration timelines for setting up a program. On the promotion and funding side, the report contains some analysis on tax credits for apprenticeships. So this is probably the most popular lever. There's 20 states currently that have got a tax credit for employers who hire apprentices. I think we saw kind of mixed results about how effective this is. So, some tax credits are often quite small. Companies might not have that much state tax liability, or they have an aggregate limit that's quite low on the tax credit. But there's definitely states, for example, South Carolina, Colorado's new tax credit, where there's a really good setup, and this seems to be a kind of key tool in the arsenal for getting employers on board with apprenticeships. And then looking at the kind of integration side, there's a lot here on kind of how states fixing the wiring around apprenticeships. So states making progress on skills-based hiring, states aligning licensing requirements with what's going on in apprenticeships to make sure that if you do an apprenticeship, you become licensed in a licensed profession. And then finally, targeted activities, just one thing to pull out here. Lots of activity on teacher apprenticeships in general, which have really expanded hugely in the last 2 years, and the majority of states have now got a teacher apprenticeship program. Final point before I hand over to Nick and the panel. So I hope this report serves two purposes. Firstly, for kind of advocacy, promoting good policy, and helping the kind of conversation between state leaders, people involved in apprenticeships. We hope this is a tool to kind of connect people together, find out what's been successful elsewhere, and secondly, as a practical resource for intermediaries looking to grow new programs. Hope this is a helpful resource to kind of show people the data, find out what support is available by state. And we're gonna look to continue this analysis, try and keep it up to date on a semi-regular basis, so it stays useful. And with that, we'll pass over to Nick to introduce the panel.
Before you do that, Nick, I just want to highlight for folks that if you have questions for Harry or the panelists, you can put them in the chat. Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks for joining us today. We have Adele Burns of the California Division of Apprenticeship Standards and Shonda Anderson, the Director of the Kansas Office of Registered Apprenticeships. So thank you both for being with me today. I guess we can start off with a question for both of you, which is just like kind of give us a kind of an overview of just kind of how apprenticeships in your particular state have changed over the past decade or so. Obviously, with a little bit of an exception for the COVID period, which things are a little all across the board. But so yeah, I guess we can start with Adele, if you would like.
Sure. Good morning, folks. Pleasure to be here. So in California, we've had a really major focus on expanding apprenticeships over the past 10 years. And it was certainly interesting to look at those numbers, Harry, that you shared. And I was looking at our own tracking. And in 2014, we had about 53,000 apprentices. And today we have about 94,000 active apprentices. So we have grown by 75% over the past 10 years. So in your report, I think you had like an overarching 60% benchmark. So when I was looking at that, I was like, okay, all right, we're doing solidly here in California. And I will say that one of the really key things that we've done a few major things over the past decade in terms of an increased focus on expanding apprenticeships. One really big change was in 2018. We actually kind of separated the worlds of apprenticeship here in California into two different areas. We have the California Apprenticeship Council, which oversees building trades apprenticeships. And then separately, we created something called the Interagency Advisory Committee on Apprenticeships to really oversee the expansion of apprenticeship. And I think that that's been really helpful because we have these two worlds, one that's a very mature, highly functioning system, and one that's a totally new system of apprenticeship as we look at expanding apprenticeships into education, into healthcare, into public sector. It's a whole different set of parameters, and this separation has also allowed us to make some really strategic investments into both sides of things. So that's certainly been some, key important areas. And as Harry mentioned, our current governor, Governor Newsom, when he took office in 2019, really set a big, ambitious goal and has been a major champion of expanding apprenticeship here in California. And he set a goal of serving 500,000 apprentices by 2029. And there's a few different ways you can track apprenticeship numbers, right? So what we looked at, what Harry was just showing is the number of active apprentices. I think it's also, in terms of tracking, it's also interesting to look at new registrations because that also does a unique count year to year of like how many people, how many individuals are coming through this apprenticeship system, are getting this opportunity to earn and learn. So we've been tracking new registrations on that road to 500,000 apprentices since that goal was set in 2019. And right now we're at literally just a few hundred shy of 200,000 apprentices. We're at 199,000 and something apprentices. So we're really continuing to grow, and it's interesting to look at the building trades apprentices under the CAC, which every year, if you look at new registrations, it's relatively steady. In 2019, it was about 28,000. This year, it looks like it's about 24,000 new apprentices, which makes sense, right? The building trades, this is a mature system of apprenticeship. It's meeting the building needs in the state. And so that's a mature system. Whereas when we look at what we call IACA apprenticeships, which is this expansion of apprenticeships into a lot of different sectors. That's where we've seen, 60+% growth just in the past 5 years. So in 2019, it was about 7,000 new apprentices a year. And now this year, it's around 11,000 new apprentices a year. So that's really where we're seeing significant growth in apprenticeship, obviously, is in expanding this earn and learn mechanism to all the different sectors of our economy. So that's just a little bit of the state policy and some of the ways in which we've been really focusing on apprenticeship expansion. And 2 years ago, we published a report that was really our overarching strategy, where we had 5 key focus areas, which overlap quite a bit with what Harry was sharing in his summary. But those 5 key areas are, of course, to really grow apprenticeships across a lot of different sectors, to support regional and sectoral apprenticeship sponsor intermediaries. We're also looking at improving representation in the building trades, which really gender representation is where it's off kilter there. And then we have a really big focus on youth apprenticeship, both for in-school youth and out-of-school youth, and a focus on growing public sector apprenticeships. So I may touch on more of those later, but that's just to give you kind of a zoomed out view. And I would say we're right in the middle of all of that work, doing policy work, making investments as a state into trying to achieve a lot of those goals. So that's just a bit about our focus in California.
And Shonda, I would love to hear about Kansas and similarly how it's kind of evolved over the past few years.
Sure. I'm going to actually share my screen if that's all right. Can everybody see my screen? Yes? Okay, great. So it's safe to say that the registered apprenticeship space in Kansas has been completely flipped on its head. We don't operate the way we used to in any way, shape, or form. And the true focus has really been to ensure that we are developing processes and policies, funding opportunities, all the things to help ensure that we are retaining and attracting Kansans to Kansas. We are no longer a flyover state. I don't know that we have ever been one, but we have a lot of economic activity happening in this state. We've won the Governor's Gold Shovel Award for Economic Development, I believe 4 years in a row, for population based on per capita, which is really phenomenal. So we have a lot of major activity in manufacturing, agriculture, healthcare, all the different things, aerospace and defense in the state of Kansas. And so really ensuring that from a Kansas Office of Registered Apprenticeship, my goal and my team's goal is one of 3 things, and one of 3 things all the time, every day. The first is providing resources and information. So when we have funding, we pass that on, but mostly we're trying to encourage and inform our established registered apprenticeship programs on how to grow, how to develop new apprenticeship programs, streamlining the process to make it easier, making sure that we're staying at the top of the market in bringing that value proposition forward and staying ahead of the game in terms of how we're operating. Number 2 is convening partners. I think before, the Office of Apprenticeship in the state of Kansas, at least, really tried to define what the apprenticeship program looked like and could be, and who the partners in the room needed to be. And that just doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a state that's as fiercely independent as Kansas is. And so our goal is to really create opportunities to convene partners, get them in the room, get them talking to each other, really think outside the box on who we can partner up to serve our very, very unique communities across the entire state of Kansas. So if that means a union wants to work with a workforce board, awesome. If that means that a small ag business wants to work with Kansas Farm Bureau, awesome. That also means that we're expanding out our multi-employer intermediaries or hubs, whatever you want to call them, with for-profits, non-for-profits. We've got economic development agencies that are intermediaries. We're working with multiple community colleges and tech colleges, universities, state departments, anybody who's willing to come forward and say, hey, we really want to take a look at this in a very serious way. Let's make it happen. The third piece is really building out our Kansas Apprenticeship Council. When I came on board, legally, statewide, we're supposed to have 9 people on a council. We had 3. And so really building that council out, because the council for the state of Kansas does review all apprenticeship programs before they're approved to be placed into Rapids. And so really building out that council to look like and be like and geographically dispersed across the state of Kansas was hugely important. And I don't do anything at a bare minimum. And so when we started really thinking about how to rebuild that council, we ended up with 13 people on a 9-person council. And so we do everything above and beyond. We've got folks from healthcare, IT, construction, union, non-union, community colleges. We're pretty diverse in terms of ethnicity and race and gender. They're spread across the entire state of Kansas. We've even got somebody that's in the Colorado Mountain Time Zone, which is clear over on the western side of Kansas. So making sure that that council is robust, is excited about registered apprenticeship, is informed on registered apprenticeship from multiple different angles, and really has the success and understanding of workforce and higher education and the economy and how that all bridges together to help move things forward. In addition to that, when a new program comes to our office, and this is really about how we've refined a lot of our policies and processes to establish new programs, we can get a program brought to us from an intermediary or a program sponsor, get it developed out, have it be meeting minimum federal law, to our council and out of our council into Rapids in under 2 weeks. So that's pretty fast because we leverage a lot of technology to do virtual voting and things like that, so that we're pushing things out and really ensuring that we're moving at the speed of business. And I really truly do believe that what we're doing is making sense. We established officially the Office of Registered Apprenticeship in 2022 under executive order. Laura Kelly, it's funny because a lot of people go, oh, well, Kansas never had an apprenticeship program. That's great. We have one now. No. We've always had an apprenticeship program. We've always been a state apprenticeship agency. We're just legitimizing it and making us as a line item in the budget, which also helps us to talk with and inform, educate our policymakers and legislators and, organizations, nonprofits across the state on the value proposition and really thinking outside the box on registered apprenticeship. The business types, we're really trying to track this very closely in terms of especially how our tax incentives work. And I noticed, Harry, in your PowerPoint, you showed a max of, I think, $12,600 or something. Kansas is actually a max of $55,000. So we'll give a max of $55,000 in tax incentives for each individual business if they have 20 apprentices hired on as W-2 employees. So from a for-profit standpoint, about 63% are still in the for-profit space. Healthcare has been growing significantly. We've got 15% in healthcare. We've got 9% in education. So these are K-12 educators who are hiring on teacher apprentices. And then about 12, 13% in the nonprofit space. When we're talking about the industry sectors that we're in, when I came on board, this pie chart maybe had 3 or 4 categories. We were almost all construction and then linemen and then maybe just a little bit of everything else. And so really thinking outside the box on how to engage and get people excited and think about new ways to do apprenticeship any job that is high value, high demand, high wage in the state of Kansas that's important to the state of Kansas, we'll sit down and have a conversation about that. I always joked that marine technology is the one occupation that I won't discuss because we are in Kansas and we don't need, anybody in marine maintenance. Well, I was wrong. We actually had somebody come forward and they've got like 4 apprentices in marine maintenance. So anyway, I always see something new literally every day. But in the last 2 to 3 years, this pie chart split looks a lot more like the state of Kansas. And that's been our charge whenever we've been talking with folks. So you can see we've really pushed the needle on teacher education apprenticeship programs. We've pushed the needle on healthcare apprenticeship programs, corporate and professional services. Agriculture is obviously something that's very important to the state of Kansas, and we are pushing the needle on that too. In the same vein, we're supporting our existing construction-based apprenticeship programs and our lineman apprenticeship programs. So really making sure that everything we have in place is supporting sort of all activity across the state. And speaking of all activity across the state of Kansas, one of the first things that I did when I came into this position was say, look, we are a state apprenticeship agency, and that's great, but we have apprentices that are residents of the state of Kansas, but they might be apprentices for Missouri or Utah or Iowa or Alaska. And our office is not recognizing them as legitimate, real registered apprenticeships. Well, that's crazy town. So we sit down and really track all of our Kansas residents in a registered apprenticeship and make sure that those employers, even if they're working with a national program or they're working with another state's program, we are helping to support them grow. We're making sure that they're tapped into the resources that we have, the tax incentives, all the different things. I won't go into it a whole lot, but I think this growth, and you've seen, I mean, obviously our high population areas have the most apprentices in those areas, but we're growing in Western Kansas as well. We're really trying to push the needle on working with our community colleges and creating customized certificates and associate degrees. We've got a letter that from the Kansas Department of Insurance or the insurance commissioner that says that it is perfectly legal to hire a 16 and 17-year-old and insure them so that businesses can have that hard conversation with their insurance providers. We've got the tax incentives in place. We are providing direct grants to our established apprenticeship programs across the state. We're leveraging several federal grants. My funding, my budget, and the funding that I have influence over went from about 2 million or so to around 30 million. And so that's been something that's been really exciting to see that transition and that aha moment. And I think that the proof is in the pudding. We track, as Adele mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to track registered apprenticeships, but I think the one piece that I'm the most proud of is that we set a really strong vision to grow to a top 25 state by 2025. When I came on board, we were 47th in the nation. In new registered apprenticeship numbers, 47th in the nation. We're now 29th. That is significant, awesome, fantastic growth. That's a 47% increase. And with that only comes with a lot of education, a lot of teamwork, and some people that are really excited to think outside the box, think courageously, and go beyond the status quo.
And Adele, we heard from Shonda some of the things that her governor's office has worked on in terms of apprenticeship. So I guess give me the perspective from California beyond Governor Newsom's goal of just like legislation or other actions that was taken to kind of help build up some of these apprenticeship programs.
Yeah, absolutely. So in California, like I mentioned, it's fantastic to have the big goal out there, right? But to Harry's point earlier, sometimes those goals, like they are galvanizing, but there's still policy and investment that has to come to follow those, and implementation that's really important. And I will say that when this talk is really looking at over the past 10 years, the progress. And about 10 years ago, California did create the California Apprenticeship Initiative grants around the same time that DOL was really expanding the investments into apprenticeship expansion. And all of those grants were awesome and definitely like got new things going. But what we really saw here in California was that it was like the grant would run out and then what? And there was like this sustainability cliff that a lot of these programs were facing. And so in 2022, there was a really big, significant set of investments made into the expansion of apprenticeship and really investments into that strategic plan that I was mentioning earlier. And one of those that I think is really important is the Apprenticeship Innovation Funding, which is offering formula funding for these, what we call IACA apprenticeships. So these are the apprenticeship programs in all the sectors outside of the building and fire trades. And this is, it's intended to be that sustainability funding that can follow, you might get an initial grant to get a new program up and off the ground, but then AIF is a formula reimbursement model. And the idea is that every year, a program sponsor can get AIF funding to help them to sustain and scale their program. So the formula that we have is that it's $3,500 per apprentice per year, plus a $1,000 completion bonus to support and incentivize the completion. And I like to say that AIF is all performance and no contracts. And to anybody who is on either side of the granting knows just how much overhead there is to administering grants. And there's with AIF and with a formula funding approach, there's no contract. You serve those apprentices, we will reimburse you those costs. So we've run 2 rounds of AIF. We have since the initial investment, we've received a total of $95 million towards AIF, and we have done 2 rounds. And again, it's formula funding, so it's not a competitive process. If you have served those apprentices and incurred those costs, the state will reimburse you for those costs. So it was about $17 million in round 1. We just announced round 2 with another $24 million that was awarded. And we processed all of these on a rolling basis. So as we got the submissions, we reviewed it and issued those payments. And we are planning to open up a 3rd round of AIF in early 2025. And so we're really excited about how this kind of formula funding can provide that sustainability equation. And so that's been like just a really, really key investment. In the same year, and ongoing as well, have been some major investments into what's called the ERICA grants, which is really looking at equal representation in construction apprenticeships. And I think that's been interesting and innovative because it's been funding both outreach and community building to try to improve gender representation in building trades, but also resources to support with childcare. So those are also some interesting investments. And then finally, a key area that's sort of hot off the presses is that we also in California this week, our governor announced the Career Education Master Plan, which has apprenticeship all over it. And this is really, it's what it sounds like, which is it's really thinking about how we make sure that our education system is preparing folks for careers. And I know that in this state report, on that first page, it puts out some really interesting stats around the faith in our higher education system to really be preparing people for careers. And I really see apprenticeship as a key mechanism to getting folks earning and learning, and really creating that bridge into a career for so many folks. And so there's a lot of really interesting work and investments being made into how we build out a whole youth apprenticeship system that really creates that bridge. And so there's a lot of interesting policy work happening around that as well.
And I'll ask both of you this question, but I'll start with Shonda. Just I guess if you had like a lesson or two to federal lawmakers, like to take some of the lessons that the states are doing and just kind of bring it to their attention? Just like what would that be beyond, obviously, increased funding overall?
Well, and I want to touch on the funding piece.
Sure.
From a state of Kansas perspective, we're very, very adamant that the funding is great. Funding is fantastic to get a program started, but a program, especially an intermediary, needs to be a business proposition, or there needs to be a business plan in place to stay sustainable. This is how the unions have leveraged the apprenticeship system since the 30s. They've got it set up in a business perspective. They're able to take care of their costs. They're able to, plan out long term. The funding that comes into place, the tax incentives, the formula funding, the grants, whatever, that's gravy. That's frosting on the cake. But for businesses and industries and associations, intermediaries that are coming to us trying to develop out an apprenticeship program because of the funding, honestly, I don't want to work with them necessarily because they're not there for the right reasons. We're really trying to push from a policy perspective and inform our legislators and policymakers on this, that a registered apprenticeship program really truly needs to be totally self-serving to the bottom line needs of that employer. Employers need to develop an apprenticeship program that's going to absolutely make sense for them. It's going to meet their skilled trades needs. It's going to do all those things. If they're doing it to be altruistic, they're likely not going to succeed. I've seen it time and time and time again. So if they're seeing the tax incentives as a coupon, the grants as gravy, I think that's great. And I think that's fantastic. From a federal standpoint, I would agree that the short-term grants tend to be a little bit difficult because of some of the administrative burden to get them started and off the ground. And then by the time that's done, you're halfway through and you're asking for a no-cost extension. So I will say that the formula funding that DOL has come out with in the last couple of years have been really fantastic. The state of Kansas has leveraged that funding to build out our office resources. So third-party audits, we're developing out some outreach resources. We've developed an EEO plan, those kinds of things. And then we're leveraging other funding to help kick off and get started new apprenticeship intermediary opportunities.
Okay. And similarly to Adele, just like what would be kind of some of your key takeaways to federal lawmakers or policymakers at various agencies here in DC?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I think it's really meaningful to have the formula funding. And, Shonda was mentioning the formula funding in creating capacity in the state to be able to do all the great work that, that you were just talking about, Shonda, which I think is really meaningful. And I think extending that formula funding to the sustainability of apprenticeship programs, I think, is really, really critical. And DOL has been a major investor in getting a lot of these program sponsor intermediaries, technical assistance intermediaries, like up and off the ground. But then this sustainability equation is so challenging. And to be honest, this formula funding, this reimbursement approach, it is a way more efficient use of funding. I mean, with AIF, this year, we deployed $24 million and funded 8,000 apprentices. I challenge any grant program to have a better cost per participant to performance to that. It is a dramatically more efficient process for everybody involved. AIF, it's once a year, you pay attention, you download from our system, how many apprentices did I serve, and therefore how much money am I eligible for? You give us a quick cost report that shows us, look, these were our costs. You tell us where to send the payment, we review it, and it's done. And that's it. There's no contracts, there's no reports, there's no quarterly reports, there's no, audit it's the whole grant world. It's an enormous amount of overhead, and it's really not very efficient for a lot of us involved. But I get that it plays an important role to get something up and off the ground. You can't have a formula funding approach to start something. That doesn't work.
Yep.
So you do need startup funding. But then once something is started, like use these formula approaches. I think it is a dramatically more efficient use of funds for everybody involved. And I just think it's a really important pivot that we need to make nationally in how we're funding apprenticeships and how we're thinking about it. And to be honest, we've piloted it here in California, but we're still figuring out the sustainability equation, right? Like we still have to advocate for this funding to be funded ongoing and not just as a, 1, 2, 3 year investment. And so I think we do this in a lot of our education side of things, like Perkins funding. Like there's a lot of formula funding out there in the education world. And I think we need to apply more of that in this apprenticeship world, because it does take work to run these apprenticeship programs, right? It's not just, they don't run themselves. There is an overhead to it. And so I think recognizing it, funding that, and making that a part of our education and workforce infrastructure is just really, really important. Policy-wise, the other thing I might just put a plug in there, it's been really, really helpful to separate the worlds of apprenticeship and the sort of policy and funding around them between the mature system of apprenticeship that is the building trades, and in California also the fire trades have a long-standing, very mature system of apprenticeship compared to the expansion of apprenticeship. Like it's just been so helpful from a policy perspective, from an approvals perspective, from a funding perspective, because the work is just totally different in those two realms. And so I think it might be interesting to consider that on a federal level. And then the final policy piece that I would put in there is in California, we do require a link to our education system. And it means that more of our apprenticeships are connected to 4-credit education, so that as an apprentice is going through their apprenticeship, they're not just getting on-the-job training and RSI from wherever, but are in many cases getting like college credits for the RSI, and in some cases even getting college credits for the on-the-job training experience that they're getting. And to the extent that we can help build a system of apprenticeship in California that allows for the flow of somebody between apprenticeship and education, like when we look to other countries, when we look to Switzerland, when we look to Germany, we really see that connection to the education system, to universities, to community colleges, to the K-12 system. And it means that somebody can flow, right? Like somebody might do high school and then do an apprenticeship and then decide I want to go do, build on that essentially AA level degree that I got through my apprenticeship to then get the 4-year degree or the master's degree. And I think it's really important that as we expand apprenticeship, that it's not just this binary, oh, you go to college or you do an apprenticeship. I don't think it has to be that way. I think that we can be building a system that really allows for options for folks. And so I think that that's like that connection to the education system, I think is also really meaningful.
Well, and to piggyback on that a little bit, I think that connection to the education system, it's such an out of the box concept, I think, for a lot of higher education professionals, that really sitting down and having that courageous conversation. This is not always easy, right? It's not always, it may not always make sense, but if you sit down and you really think through it and you understand that the mastery level component of a registered apprenticeship goes from a linear learning curve to an exponential learning curve, and the value proposition that it has to the economy is just so significant. For the state of Kansas, when we've got counties that are at 2% unemployment, 0% unemployment, everyone who has a job or 2 or 3, we've got to find new ways to get them engaged in the economy. And I think in terms of really trying to push the value proposition on registered apprenticeship and making sure that people have the tools to make the good decisions is something that's really important. We've sat down and have been working on a return on investment study very similar to the Harvard study and very similar to, I believe, the AAR study, but specifically with Kansas employers. So I know nationally everybody hears it's about $1.48% or $1.48 return on investment for every dollar invested by an employer's behalf. For the state of Kansas, we're showing it's actually closer to $2.13. So making sure that we have very Kansas-specific examples and resources to help us grow, I think, is also very important. And from a federal engagement and policy making process, really ensuring that the states have what they need to meet their very unique needs is something that's incredibly important. And so just expanding that train of thought, I think, is going to be essential rather than trying to nationalize an entire system.
And at the risk of kind of ending all things on a little bit of a down note, but I guess just could you kind of just speak to what either an under-discussed kind of hindrance to scalability or something that perhaps you have actually like seen in the past that you now have a solution for in a way that you didn't previously in terms of getting these projects to scale and be able to both break into new industries and also expand existing footprints for both of you, obviously.
So Nick, you're asking like the lessons learned?
Yeah, either a lessons learned or a thing that is still kind of like a thorny like thing that keeps programs from expanding.
One thing that I will say is certainly like just a big challenge that we are in process on is and I think Shonda touched a little bit on this earlier, is youth apprenticeship. I think that there's a real interest to be expanding youth apprenticeship, but when you're employing 16 and 17-year-olds, it gets real tricky from so many perspectives. They may be in high school, so you need to make sure that you're building your apprenticeship program to allow them to both complete high school and embark on an apprenticeship journey. So like the alignment there is really, really tricky. It's also really tricky to get employers to be willing to hire 16 and 17-year-olds at the initial phase of their apprenticeship. And I think that we're trying to build, it's kind of logistically not possible to complete an apprenticeship while in high school, just like hours wise. So we're trying to build apprenticeship programs that may start in high school, but then branch to afterwards. And just all of the pieces of that, there's a lot of stakeholders at that table. And it is a work in progress, I would say. But I think we're certainly really motivated to try to work on it because there's so many opportunity youths, right? Like folks who are 16 to 24 that are disconnected from our education system, not on a solid career track, and is really like, we want to be doing more to build the infrastructure around making sure that we're creating those supported career education pathways. And but the policy and like the employer facing policy and the educational policy, it's a tricky nut to crack. So we're definitely still working on it.
Yeah, the youth apprenticeship piece is definitely hard to do sometimes. We were really blessed to be able to participate with National Governors Association, and I think I saw Jordan Meringue on the call, to sort of define what youth registered apprenticeship looks like for the state of Kansas. And so in trying to, with a registered apprenticeship, the stackable credential piece is real, right? And so you can stack whatever types of industry recognized credentials or associate degrees or high school diploma, whatever you want to, into a registered apprenticeship. So for the state of Kansas, what we're trying to define youth registered apprenticeship as is it's a paid employment and training opportunity that starts as early as 16 years of age. So trying to keep that fairly open, because then you also get into the definition of youth with WIOA and wraparound services and displaced worker definitions and things like that. So one of the big things that we've done for the state of Kansas that really truly has been a game changer, and I think will continue to prove to be a game changer, is we worked with the governor's office, the Kansas Department of Insurance, the Kansas Insurance association, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 different associations, to come up with this letter that really does encourage the conversation to happen between the employer and their insurance agent or their workman's comp insurance provider. And it very clearly states that the classification manual and rules manual with the National Council on Compensation Insurance, insurance rates are not defined by age. It's defined on the nature of the work. And so really pushing through this mantra of it's illegal for me to hire someone under the age of 18 in a hazardous occupation area. No, it's not. It actually is perfectly legal as long as it's one of these 7 exempted hazardous occupations or HOs. So really ensuring that that gets out there. The letter is posted online. I'll put it in the chat. You can download it and use it and look at it or whatever. I believe Kansas is maybe one of 4 or 5 states in the nation that has a letter like this, but it's at least trying to push that conversation piece. I think too, sort of some ahas in terms, and I've touched on it already once before, but ensuring that the state office, the state agency, is not defining what other people's apprenticeships look like or other people's partnerships and who they bring to the table. I can't tell you how powerful that is. Letting local communities, letting local industries, organizations define who they need to bring to the table to be successful only increases that overall success. We recognize that in the state of Kansas, we're almost creating an economy of apprenticeships, which means that there is competition, but that's okay because it gives employers options in deciding who they're going to work with the best. So really ensuring, and I think from a national policy standpoint and even a state policy standpoint, ensuring that there is that opportunity for decision making at the employer level, making sure that they are driving the car on what their apprenticeship looks like and what road they're taking, so long as that registered apprenticeship meets that minimum federal law.
I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I just wanted to check with Harry and see if he wants to say anything to wrap things up.
I think we probably should wrap up because we're getting people to start to move on to those meetings. I just want to say a massive thanks to Adele, Shonda, and Nick for sharing your stories and being great advocates of apprenticeships. We'll send around a recording of this, and I think there's probably a few questions in the chat that we haven't picked up, so we'll make sure we do that after the webinar. Renee, is there anything that I've missed?
Yep, I was going to say thank you everyone for your patience. I know we're starting to lose folks here. I am recording the conversation. I will share the slides. If Shonda and Adele and Nick would be good enough, and Harry good enough to take a look at the questions I'll save in the chat, it'd be great if you could send responses to those. There are a few there. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Please go visit AFA apprenticeshipsforamerica.org. We have a conference coming in February, and so we would love to see many, if not all of you there. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a wonderful day.